Frank Sinatra was sitting in his Palm Springs compound on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when two men in expensive suits knocked on his door. They weren't fans seeking autographs or reporters chasing a story. They were emissaries from Tony, the Tiger Torino, one of the most feared crime bosses on the East Coast. The message they delivered was simple and terrifying. Torino's daughter Maria was getting married in 2 weeks, and he wanted Frank Sinatra to perform at the reception. This wasn't a request or an invitation. It was a demand backed by the kind of violence that had made Torino's name whispered in fear from New York to Las Vegas. But what Frank told those messengers would shock Torino so completely that it would change how the entire underworld viewed the chairman of the board. Frank's response wasn't what anyone expected, and it would prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is show respect when someone expects fear. To understand why Tony Torino's demand was so dangerous, you need to understand who he was and what he was capable of. Torino controlled illegal gambling, labor unions, and protection rackets across 3 states. He had built his empire through calculated brutality and an absolute refusal to accept the word no from anyone. When Torino wanted something, he got it, and the few people who had tried to refuse him had experienced consequences that served as permanent warnings to others. Torino's daughter Maria was the apple of his eye, and her wedding was going to be the social event of the year in certain circles, a display of power and wealth that would cement Torino's status among his peers. Frank Sinatra represented everything Torino coveted, but couldn't simply buy or intimidate into submission. Frank was famous, respected, and connected to the kind of legitimate power that Torino desperately wanted to access. Having Frank Sinatra perform at his daughter's wedding would be the ultimate status symbol, proof that even America's greatest entertainer would bow to Torino's will. It would also be a message to rival crime families and law enforcement that Torino's influence extended into the highest levels of American entertainment. The two messengers who came to Frank's door were professionals who had delivered similar ultimatums hundreds of times before. They explained Torino's request politely but firmly, making it clear that this was not a negotiation. Mr. Torino would be very grateful if you could perform 3 songs at his daughter's reception. One of them said, "He's prepared to pay you $50,000 for 1 hour of your time." The amount was enormous for a single performance, but everyone in the room understood that the real message wasn't about money. It was about power and the consequences of refusing a man like Tony Torino. Frank listened to the entire presentation without interrupting, his face revealing nothing about what he was thinking. When the messengers finished speaking, Frank stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at his swimming pool for a long moment. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the 2 men waited for his response, knowing that they would have to report Frank's decision back to their boss. Finally, Frank turned around and said something that neither messenger had anticipated. "I'll do it, but I have conditions." But what's truly striking is what Frank's conditions revealed about his character and his understanding of how to deal with dangerous men. Instead of refusing Torino's demand outright, which would have created a potentially deadly confrontation, Frank chose to turn the situation into something entirely different. First, Frank said, "I don't want any money. This is a wedding gift for the bride." The messengers looked confused. In their world, everything was transactional. Everything had a price. Frank continued, "Second, I choose the songs. And third, Mr. Torino comes to see me personally to discuss the details." The third condition was the one that left the messengers speechless. Frank was demanding that one of the most powerful crime bosses in America come to him like a supplicant seeking a favor. In the underworld hierarchy, this was an almost unthinkable reversal of power dynamics. Tony Torino was used to summoning people to his presence, not being summoned himself. But Frank's tone made it clear that these conditions were non-negotiable. If Torino wanted Frank Sinatra at his daughter's wedding, he would have to accept Frank's terms. The messengers returned to New York with Frank's response, and according to later accounts, Torino's initial reaction was explosive rage. He had expected either immediate compliance or outright refusal, both of which he knew how to handle. But Frank's counterproposal put him in an impossible position. He couldn't simply reject Frank's conditions, because that would mean his daughter wouldn't have Frank Sinatra at her wedding, which would be a public humiliation. But accepting the conditions meant acknowledging that Frank Sinatra had more power in this negotiation than he did. This is exactly where everything shifted. 3 days later, Tony Torino flew to Palm Springs in his private jet to meet with Frank personally. The crime boss, who had never traveled to meet anyone except other family heads, was coming to Frank's home to discuss wedding arrangements. Word of this unprecedented meeting spread quickly through both the entertainment industry and organized crime circles, with everyone wondering what Frank Sinatra could possibly have said to force such a powerful man to come calling. The meeting between Frank and Torino lasted 2 hours and took place by Frank's pool, away from any recording devices or witnesses. According to Frank's later accounts to close friends, the conversation began with Torino trying to assert dominance, reminding Frank of his power and influence. But Frank had done his homework. He knew about Torino's daughter Maria, her education, her interests, and her genuine love for her father despite his criminal activities. Frank used this knowledge to completely change the direction of their conversation. "Your daughter means everything to you," Frank told Torino. "I can see that. You want her wedding to be perfect, and you want her to be proud of her father. I respect that. I also know that Maria loves music, that she's a fan of mine, and that having me perform would make her genuinely happy. So I'm going to do this, but not because you demanded it. I'm going to do it because she deserves to have beautiful music on the most important day of her life." You haven't seen Frank Sinatra's real struggle yet. What Frank did next was psychological genius that completely disarmed one of the most dangerous men in America. Instead of treating Torino as a threat to be feared or an enemy to be defeated, Frank treated him as a father who wanted the best for his daughter. Frank talked about his own children, about the lengths any parent would go to make their children happy, and about the universal desire to give our kids memories that will last a lifetime. By the end of their conversation, Torino was no longer the threatening crime boss who had sent messengers to make demands. He was a father grateful to Frank for understanding what Maria's wedding meant to him. Frank had taken a potentially deadly confrontation and transformed it into a conversation between two men who, despite their vastly different lives, shared the common experience of loving their children more than anything else in the world. Everything up to now was just the surface. Frank's performance at Maria Torino's wedding became the stuff of legend, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Instead of performing his biggest hits, Frank chose 3 songs that were specifically meaningful to Maria, songs she had mentioned in interviews as her favorites, songs that would make her wedding day genuinely special rather than just impressive to her father's associates. Frank sang "The Way You Look Tonight" for her first dance, a tender ballad during dinner, and ended with an upbeat number that got everyone dancing. But the most extraordinary part of the evening was Frank's behavior toward the Torino family. He didn't treat them as dangerous criminals who were paying for his services. He treated them as a family celebrating their daughter's happiness. Frank spent time talking with Maria about her honeymoon plans, complimented her dress, and even danced with Torino's elderly mother. By the end of the evening, Frank had transformed himself from a reluctant performer into an honored guest who genuinely cared about making the wedding perfect. Tony Torino was so moved by Frank's approach that he did something unprecedented in his criminal career. He publicly thanked Frank and told everyone present that Frank Sinatra was a man of honor and respect. Coming from someone like Torino, this was the ultimate endorsement, a statement that would protect Frank from any future mob-related problems. Frank had not only avoided a dangerous confrontation, he had gained a powerful ally by choosing respect over fear. Hard to believe, but Frank's handling of the Torino wedding demand became a template that other entertainers studied when faced with similar situations. Frank had shown that it was possible to deal with dangerous people without compromising your dignity or principles. By refusing to be intimidated and instead finding common ground, Frank had turned a potential enemy into a grateful friend. Wait, don't miss this moment. Years later, when Maria Torino was asked about her wedding, she said that Frank Sinatra's performance was the most beautiful part of an already perfect day. He sang like he was performing for his own daughter, she recalled. You could tell he genuinely cared about making it special for me, not just impressive for my father. That meant everything to a young bride who just wanted her wedding day to be about love, not about power. The story of Frank's response to Tony Torino's demand spread throughout the entertainment industry and the criminal underworld, but the details were often misunderstood. Some people thought Frank had simply given in to mob pressure, while others believed he had somehow intimidated a crime boss. The truth was more complex and more impressive than either interpretation. Frank had used intelligence, empathy, and genuine human connection to transform a dangerous situation into something beautiful. Entertainment industry insiders began studying Frank's approach, understanding that he had created a new template for dealing with dangerous people who couldn't be refused, but also couldn't be allowed to control you. Frank's reply to Torino's demand wasn't about courage or defiance. It was about understanding what the crime boss really wanted and finding a way to give it to him while maintaining dignity and respect on both sides. Frank had seen through Torino's threatening exterior to the loving father underneath, and by addressing that father rather than the criminal, Frank had achieved something that force or fear never could have accomplished. The mob boss, who had expected either submission or resistance, instead encountered something he had never experienced before: genuine respect and understanding from someone who wasn't afraid of him, but also wasn't trying to challenge him. Frank's approach left Torino speechless, because it was completely outside his experience of how powerful people usually dealt with his demands. Frank Sinatra's handling of the Torino wedding demand became a masterclass in conflict resolution, showing that sometimes the most effective way to deal with a dangerous person is to find their humanity and connect with it. The crime boss who had tried to intimidate Frank ended up becoming one of his most loyal protectors, and the wedding that was supposed to be a display of criminal power became instead a celebration of family love and beautiful music. The man who had built his empire through fear discovered that day that there was something more powerful than intimidation: genuine human connection. Frank's reply left Tony Torino speechless, not because it was threatening or surprising, but because it was kind, respectful, and focused on what really mattered: a father's love for his daughter and a daughter's joy on her wedding day.